Hello! Today I'm coming at you with two BYOPs, both themed around the new upcoming Glaminatrix Sugar and Spice palette. Now, as it is well documented, I am a self-classified makeup goblin, and when I saw the Glaminatrix palette, my little goblin brain immediately was like, I have to have it. But the whole purpose of me owning all of these single eyeshadows is so I don't buy palettes. That, in addition to the fact that the pans are a little bit smaller than the average 26mm pan, was enough to get me out of the buying spirit and instead inspired me to go through my collection and create as close of a dupe to the palette as possible. And after receiving a request from one of you, let me know if you want a shout out down in the description of this video. But after receiving a request to do my take on the theme, I jumped at the opportunity, and so that is what you're looking at now. So I'm going to start with my version, walk you through what I was thinking, and then reveal what the actual palette looks like if somehow you haven't seen it yet. So if you want a walkthrough of two BYOPs that I've done recently, then go ahead and just keep on watching and subscribe. So unfortunately, I had already seen what the actual palette looked like by the time I got around to making my own based on the description of the palette and the theme. I tried my hardest not to let that influence me and what I decided to pick in here, but I feel like there's no way that it didn't. However, I still tried my best to read the description of the palette that was provided before they did the reveal and use that as my inspiration. So I want to go through that post with you now and read the description to you, as well as kind of walk through my thought process and what stood out to me from the description. The description reads, "Sugar and Spice, the perfect sweet everyday eyeshadow palette with a little bit of spice. We created the perfect everyday palette with our unique flavor combinations, with the aim to make it approachable for every skin tone and makeup preference. The palette includes highly impactful duochromes and multichromes combined with everyday wearable mattes. Set off with a unique combination of pastels that can be mixed into the neutral mattes to create a grungy, cool, or warm-toned eye look." So with that in mind, the things that stuck out to me are that they described it as a sweet everyday palette, which to me means that it's leaning more into the sweet side rather than the little bit of spice. The next thing that stuck out to me was that it was supposed to be approachable for every skin tone and makeup preference. I really decided to focus in on the skin tone aspect of this and think about the depth and undertones of a variety of skin tones. So I know that for lighter skin tones, we're talking more about cool and warm in the idea of like pink and yellow, whereas in deeper skin tones, we're talking more about golden and red undertones, but there also are olive and neutral undertones to be considered. So I tried to take that approach in deciding what mattes to choose and keeping in mind all of those different undertones and making sure that there was something for everyone that would be neutral in this palette. I also knew from the description that there were going to be duochrome and multichrome shades, so I tried to exclusively pick shimmer shadows that had a duochrome or multichrome effect. And then lastly, of course, the word pastels stuck out to me. I am a major pastel lover, and so the idea of mixing pastels with more everyday kind of shades was really exciting to me. And so again, because I knew that the theme was overall wearable, everyday approachable for every skin tone, I decided to keep the pastels limited to those main undertones that we see in folks' skin. And lastly, they mentioned that you should be able to create grungy, cool, or warm-toned eye looks, so I wanted to make sure that I had shades that could create that combination of different looks. And I'm pretty proud of what I came up with. Now, with that explanation out of the way, let's get to swatching. The first shade up is Depotted from the Simply Posh Fairy Tale Fairies palette, which you can buy as singles now, which is very exciting. I decided to call this shade Mint because I wanted this top row to be sweet, then the middle row to be kind of more of a sweet and spicy mix, and then the last row to be all spice. So we're sticking with mostly sweeter names in this top row. Next, we've got the Looxi shade Champagne Punch, and I decided to call this shade Sugar in the palette because it felt like we needed something called Sugar, and out of everything in here, this is kind of giving me the most sugary vibe. Now we've got the Dandelions Co. shade Peony, and I wanted to call this shade Pink Salt, which I know doesn't fit our sugary theme for the top row, but honestly, I was like, there aren't that many things that are this bright of a pink in the spice world, so you gotta take the names where they come. Again, we have one that isn't super sweet, but I decided to call this shade Basil, and the reason is it's got a light green base and then shifts to a pink, green, gold, and all of those different shades can be found in different types of basil, and since there is a sweet basil, I figured it still kind of worked for this top row. This shade in reality is made by my wonderful friend Riley, Seeking Shifts, in collaboration with Shine by SD, and it is a real stunner. Last up for this top row, we have the shade Ginger, and again, ginger, not necessarily sweet, but gets paired with sweet stuff quite a bit. And in reality, this is the Menagerie shade Drought, although they don't sell these as singles anymore, which super sucks. Oh, and I just realized, I don't think I told you this shade is Verdigris. I told you who it was by, but I didn't tell you what it was called. All together though, we've got a pretty light, bright, pastel-y top row. And based on the description of the palette, I think so far we've hit those pastels and we've hit a duochrome with like a light pink to gold and then a little bit like silvery blue on the edge. And then we also have got our first multi-chrome with that pink, gold, green. Starting with the second row, we've got what I'm calling lavender, which, fun fact, is one of my favorite flavors and scents. But this in reality is the shade Celtic from Glam Shop. And again, pretty light, pretty bright. I wanted to stick with stuff that was pretty wearable, easy, but also felt grounded in something a little bit more neutral. So I just thought that this was a good one to add, especially for those more cool toned looks that you might want to get out of this type of palette. And then lastly, our last like truly sweet shade in this palette is the Clionadh shade Baroque. And I'm calling this one Saffron, which again, not a sweet flavor in itself, but can be paired really nicely with sweeter flavors. And I think this is going to be the best that I'm able to show the shift on this shadow. So we've got a pinky purple that goes to like a peach, and then a golden, almost leaning like a little bit golden green. The next two shades are both depotted. I believe that the first one may be depotted from the Desi and Katie Friendcation palette from Dose of Colors. Don't judge me for how long ago that came out. And then the second one, I think may be from KKW, but in my palette, these two shades would be Paprika and Nutmeg. So again, we're getting a little bit spicier, but we're still having a few things that can pair well with sweet flavors. And I thought that that was a good way of thinking about it in terms of it pairing with these lighter, brighter, sugary shades from the top row. And then to round out our second row, we've got one last matte. This is the shade Plankton
from Menagerie.
I don't think they actually meant it to be said like that, but that's how I say that word every time because SpongeBob rules my life. In my palette though, this shade would be oregano because I mean, come on, that's the color of oregano. Really, it's the color of like 90% of spices, it feels like, but I chose to call it oregano. Now we're getting into our truly spicy row. This first shade is cinnamon in my palette, and it's another depotted shade. I believe it may be from Glamlight. Now we've got the deepest shade in the palette, which I decided to call Pepper. It's a really dark brown leaning on black, and I think that this is depotted from a Viseart palette. This next shade I'm calling Cumin, but in reality, it's Celeste from Shine by SD. It's another multi-chrome because I felt like we needed a couple. And this one has a more gray base with a warm orange to golden orange to straight up gold to a little bit green. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get that green shift quite all the way to where it truly goes. These last two shades I'm calling Clove and Curry. But in reality, the first one is Bernovich X06, and then the last one is Looxi Spiced Lemon. Can't do a BYOP without including some good Looxi. So here they are, and Spiced Lemon is very much so giving curry to me. I wanted to have a turmeric shade, but it just didn't fit with what I was building and like the color that turmeric is. So this was my compromise. Again, I tried my best to include matte shades that would work for a variety of depths and undertones found within skin, but I also did want to include some pops of pastel and a bunch of different duochrome and multi-chrome shadows. So I feel like overall I'm pretty happy with it, and I could see a lot of looks that could be done with this palette, but you guys will have to let me know down below. What do you think of Catherine's version of the Sugar and Spice palette? Now that you've seen my version, I feel like the time has come to show you my dupe of what the real version of the palette looks like. So here's mine versus the dupe, and I didn't get the dupe perfectly, I know that, but I think I got the essence pretty well, so you can compare my essence versus the actual essence. I thought it would be pretty fun to put this BYOP in the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette, just because it's from the same brand. But that also kind of affected what shades I could choose because I was limited to 26mm circle pans. Even with that limitation though, I do feel pretty good about what I was able to create. So let's go ahead and dive into it. First up, we've got a pretty classic iridescent multi-chrome kind of shade. This has a very soft pink base with a gold to green to teal and a little bit blue shift. And this one specifically is the shade Garden Picnic from Copacetic Cosmetics. Next up, we have what has become the bane of my existence. This is the shade Fennel in the Glaminatrix palette. I put in here for the Booze from NBA Cosmetics, but I know that this one isn't right. This one doesn't go to quite as true of a green as the one in the Glaminatrix palette seems to go to. It is a really beautiful and unique color, and if they do sell their shades from this palette as singles, I would really consider picking this one up. You also may have noticed in the corner of my version, I had this shade. This is Opulent from Clionadh, and I wanted to give this an honorable mention. Obviously, because of the pan shape, I couldn't fit it into the best dupe version of the palette, but I think that this one may be a little bit closer to what's actually in the palette because it's got that more mauve-y base compared to the gray base. The flip on these is essentially the same. And again, I don't think it goes to quite as strong of a green as the one in the palette seems to go to, but I do think that this is probably my closest dupe out of my whole collection. We've got next the only shade that is considered to be a shimmer in the palette. My dupe version is the Terra Moon's shade Palladium, and I think that this one does a good job of emulating how dang sparkly it looks like the Glaminatrix shade is going to be based on all of the videos and stuff so far. This next shimmer shade is probably the next most difficult shade I had when duping out this palette. It felt like this and the other green both looked really different depending on whose photos you look at. And I want to say shout out to Newport and Julia K. March, who had some of the best swatch photography for this palette and who I find to typically be some of the most accurate photos. So that's who I ended up going off of. And I feel like in my version, these two shades look really similar. I'm curious how similar they actually look in the real palette though. For my palette, I chose to use the shade Rockstar from Looxi. Lastly, for the top row, they have a black-based multi-chrome that is like a traditional red, gold, green color story. I have that color a few times over, but I actually prefer something with a little bit of a lighter base because I find it easier to work with. And so I decided to go with Touch of Glam the 21st in my palette. And I want to note some of these brands that I've mentioned are brands that I'm not currently supporting. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check out the link in my description for a few videos on those topics. Now the palette has a row full of mattes, which I thought was really interesting. And it seems like in general they lean pretty cool tone, and the first two are actually lighter, I think, than what I picked, but I didn't want two cream-ish mattes, so I decided to kind of go a different route. This first shade is Dandelion's Apple Butter, and then the second shade is Depotted from the ColourPop and Avatar palette. So really, I mean, it's just kind of a light cool toned brown and a light warm tone brown. Then we make a pretty stark jump to some deeper matte colors. First up, I've got the shade Oud from the Nabla Singles reboot. And again, leaning a little bit more cool tone, I thought, at least based on the photos I saw. And then this fourth shade I actually used from the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette, although I don't remember what this shade actually was. And then the last shade in this all matte row looked like it was a really deep brown or black. I didn't actually have a black in a 26mm circle pan, so I decided to go with a really deep green from the Mountain Trail bundle by Sydney Grace. And then the last row is the pastel row. So we've got a pastel yellow, and for this one, I decided to use Terra Moon's Twilight, which is like my favorite pastel matte, but is discontinued. Next, we've got the Looxi shade Stormy Morning, and this is just a purple with a pink to a little bit of a gold shift. I also could have easily used Clionadh Tracery if it fit in this circle pan palette. Next, we've got another Terra Moon's matte. This is the shade Star Crazy, I believe. It's just really a pastel purple. I find that there is a Dandelion's matte that is really close to this purple. So if you want to see that, I'll link my Terra Moon's dupe video down below. Rounding out the palette, we've got a kind of duochrome that has a brown base with a blue to pink flip on top. I used the Glam Shop shade Cool Warm for that, and I'm not sure, there you can kind of see the pink shift in it. And then lastly, we've got another Menagerie matte. This is the shade Flipper, which again no longer sold. I feel like a lot of the single shadow mattes I have are no longer available, which super sucks. But here is my best attempt at the Dupe palette all together, and I'll pop up a picture of Julia and Nupor's swatches, although I would recommend you check out their Instagrams linked below, just so that way you can see my best attempt at what this palette actually looks like versus what I have done. And let me raise my arm a little bit, and hopefully maybe we'll be able to catch a little bit more of those shifts. All right, well, that's all I've got for you today. Let me know in the comments down below, do you prefer my version of the palette or my closest dupe of the palette? Is this a palette that you're planning on picking up? Is it a color story that intrigues you? What do you think of Glaminatrix overall? Whatever your thoughts are, leave them down in the comments below. And until I see you next time, I hope that you stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy. Bye!